fans, it's your boy Gsluke here for our weekly DFS fades and sleepers for the Charles Schwab Challenge. It's Wednesday, that means we have a much better idea of what ownership is going to look like, and we can start to talk about some of the game theory aspect and of course ownership, which is oh so important for these large field GPPs. In this video, I'll be talking about my top 3 fades this week, or the players that I'll be avoiding because of ownership or because of skill set for whatever reason. I don't expect them to have the week that a lot of the rest of the industry might be projecting for. And of course, we'll be talking about my top 3 sleeper picks. Those plays are going to be relatively low owned, perhaps overlooked players for the Charles Schwab that I expect to maybe go out there and surprise. In either circumstance, this is the most important video that I put out every single week because we start to talk about the strategy side of DFS, which is arguably just as maybe even more important than the actual projection side of things. So with a lot to talk about, let's go ahead and start this off with our fades of the week. All right, we've got the projections up. Let's go ahead and start this off with Max Homa as our first fade. So at $9,400, he's going to be the highest owned play on the slate, at least as of right now. Projections are going to mature throughout the day, but in either circumstance, people are loving themselves some Max Homa this week. And if you take a look at the recent form, I get it, right? He's been on quite the stretch of golf. Top 15 finish at the PGA, won at the Wells Fargo, also a solid finish at the team event. Now at the Masters wasn't all that impressive, and really the reason why people like playing Max Homa is the ball striking stats. So if we bring that up here, you can see he's gaining a ton of strokes off the tee and on approach. You'd expect that from somebody that won and then just finished in the top 15 the week afterwards, and then the putter has been just slightly above average. You take a look at the last 50 measured rounds, they're much more tempered than what we've seen over the last 24. You can see he's still an extremely consistent ball striker. So that's the positive side of Max Homa. The unfortunate downside is he's also a very volatile player. He's no stranger to going out there and missing cuts. And just to give you an example of that, just take a look at the fall swing or even the early part of 2022. He went through quite a rough stretch there where he was missing cuts week in and week out, wasn't really posting those top 25 finishes. So for as much as I love Max Homa, for as much as I'm happy we hit on him at the Wells Fargo Championship, I'm not willing to get there when he's the highest owned play on the slate and probably more expensive than he should be as well. I mean, he's just $300 less than a Sam Burns, which in my opinion, Sam Burns is a much better player than Max Homa, pretty much in a vacuum no matter what golf course we're at. And guys like an Abraham Answer, just $100 less, Sanjay M for $200 less, and you're looking at a solid 6, maybe even 7% less ownership in the GPP contest, let alone in higher dollar contests where a guy like a Max Homa might come in closer to 30 or even 35% ownership. So it depends what kind of contest you're in, but for me, he's going to be a fade this week. I understand the skill set. You know, I'm somebody that likes to play Max Homa a lot more than my peers, but just not when he's at this inflated level of price and ownership. So something I'm worried about with his game would be the driving accuracy. Of course, Max Homa, a little bit known for his distance over his accuracy. He's not really a prolific off the tee player though, so in either circumstance, he's not going to be able to really take advantage of that this week. And the approach play, right, while it's been stellar over his last 24 measured rounds, he has been known to go into streaky sets of form, right? He goes out there and gains a ton of strokes with the approach to the field, like we've seen over the last 2 to 3 events. But he tends to sprinkle in those events where he loses to the field, and that's usually where he's trunk slamming and is enraging the rest of the field. And I think that's a legitimate possibility this week, right? If he was, let's say, $9,000, let's say he was like 13, 15% owned, like a lot of the other players in this range, I'd be a lot more willing to get to Max Homa. But when he's the number 1 owned play on the entire slate, that really puts it in a completely different level of context. So for me, the bent grass putting struggles are also a negative that he has working against him. You can see he loses close to a 4/10 of a stroke per round more on bent grass than he has over his last 50 measured rounds. And I just think he's coming in with a little bit too much steam. Next up, we have Daniel Berger as our next fade. He'll be there at $9,000. And for him, I'm really worried about his health. I mean, first off, the form has not been there. If you take a look at his last 24 measured rounds, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. He's losing on approach. Off the tee, he's just a slight gainer, which is something that he's not used to doing. He's usually much better in that category. And even with the short game, he hasn't been quite as sharp as in the past. So clearly something's up. He's either extremely rusty or still dealing with the back injury. In either circumstance, I'm not going to spend $9,000 for a golfer that's coming in with all those question marks and is also still 16% owned. So if we hop over here, you can see I'm at 16.5% in terms of projected ownership. That's higher than somebody like a Tony Finau, who's played some pretty solid golf of late. It's more than a Taylor Gooch, who had that really solid finish at the PGA Championship. He's also a core pick for us. So with all of that in mind, he's a pretty clear fade for us here. I understand that from a pedigree perspective, he's obviously a little bit underpriced, should probably be where Sam Burns is, or at least right around that if he was playing like he had for the last 2, maybe 2.5 years. But it's hard to buy back in on somebody when we have so many solid options around him. I mean, I love Abraham Ancer this week. I think Sungjae Im is in a great spot to get out there. It's a perfect course fit. Of course, we haven't seen him much over the last 2 to 3 weeks, but I'm more confident in a Sungjae Im that's not really dealing with an injury. Of course, he had COVID. That's why we didn't see him, as opposed to Daniel Berger that might legitimately be hurting. I mean, during the fall swing outside the Honda Classic, he looked really rough out there. He was grabbing his back after a lot of shots. He's had to withdraw from multiple events over the last even month or two on tour, so it's not something that's completely in his rearview mirror. I don't think it's worth taking that risk, right? It's just if he was single digit owned, right? Maybe I'd take him 15% of lineups, try to get a little bit of leverage to the field, but he's coming in with significant ownership. In fact, what is he, he's like the 5th or 6th highest owned play on the entire slate period. So I'm certainly not going to be as sneaky as I think a lot of people out there are expecting. And now lastly, we have Davis Riley as the 3rd fade on the slate at $8,400. And Davis Riley impressed last week. I had him in lineups. I was able to take advantage on the prop side as well. So certainly understand a lot of the momentum behind him. But for him to be as high owned as he is, which let's just talk about the stats. I mean, if you take a look at the last 24 measured rounds, they really speak for themselves. He's losing on approach, right? Kind of like a Daniel Berger. It's hard to believe in a player that hasn't been getting it done of late. And they're in this $8,000 range now. It's a little bit less so than the guys that are in the 9K range. You're really, paying a premium for those guys up top. But even an 8K range golfer, that's more expensive than most, right? You're investing into this player with more confidence than most. And you want your guys gaining on approach. I mean, that's a pretty easy thing to ask for on tour. Off the tee, he gains a ton of his strokes. With his putter, he tends to do a lot of that as well. The issue here is on bent grass, he doesn't gain many strokes. For his career, it's by far his worst surface. In fact, loses about 0.6 of a stroke more per round on bent grass than he does any other surface. So if the putting is going to come back to earth, if the approach play hasn't even been there over the quote-unquote hot stretch of golf that he's been on, and he's only going to carry himself with the off-the-tee play, which you can't really tune into this week because of the fact that they're so narrow. There's so many layup spots that people are going to be hitting to. I don't think this is the right golf course for Davis Riley. So I have him at just 13.4% ownership, so it's not like he's outrageously high owned, but that's still more than somebody like a Billy Horschel. It's just slightly lower than somebody like a Mito Pereira, who almost ended up winning the PGA Championship last week. And it's more than guys even like a Chris Kirk or a Kevin Na that are just clearly better plays for me on this slate. So going to be a fade in that 8K range and somebody that I have in 0 of my lineups. And now let's head over to the sleeper picks, right? So we talked about some of the guys that we'll be avoiding. Now let's talk about some of the guys that I think are going to be a little bit sneaky this week. So first and foremost, we have Sam Burns at $9,700. And to begin the week, he was a clear fade for me. And it was lazy analysis. I know that he's not good on bent grass. That's something that he's kind of been known for in his career. And this is a quote-unquote positional golf course, right? So you would think that a guy like Sam Burns would just immediately be a write-off. But it seems like a lot of the field is doing that too, right? He's at 13.9% projected ownership. And I think that might actually be a little bit high. It might actually come in closer to something like the 12 or 11% mark. In general, Sam Burns is number 3 in my modeling for this week. So the numbers absolutely love him here. And if we just put aside the bent grass numbers, right, which I know is asking a lot, but at the same time, we've still seen him have some success on the surface. I mean, just look at last week at Southern Hills. He putted the absolute lights out. In fact, over his last 24 measured rounds, he's gaining a ton of strokes on the greens, over a stroke per round. So it hasn't really hampered him of late. So maybe we can throw that aside, right? And then you have to think about the off-the-tee play. Last year's winner was Jason Kokrak, another player who has a similar shots gained profile to somebody like a Sam Burns. Right? If you just go ahead and bring them up here for you. Where's Jason Kokrak at? down here, $8,200, right? He gains off the tee, he gains on approach. He's a little bit inconsistent with the approach play. Sam Burns gains a ton of strokes with the putting. He gains off the tee with his distance, right? And the approach play can be a little bit inconsistent, but he tends to pop in that category. Two relatively similar players. All he has to do is hit some fairways here, right? If he decides to go out there and hit drivers, sure, it's going to be a little bit of a boom-bust type of strategy. But if he's hitting fairways, he's going to have wedges into greens. It's going to be able to take this play slow. If he decides to play it smart and just hit hybrids off the tee, something like a 3-4 iron off the tee, he can also still take this place apart. He has more than enough length to reach every single hole still with a mid-iron at the very most. So at $9,700, I think he's an X factor that maybe my lazy analysis at first, would have taken me off of, but the more and more I think about it, the more and more upside I know that he has. And there's definitely things that have to fall into place for Sam Burns. One is the driving accuracy. He's either going to have to lay up off the tee or either be extremely accurate off the tee with the driver, which could be asking a bit. And he's also going to have to get over the bent grass struggles, right? But if he does both of those things, he is more than capable of running away with this event. I mean, winning this by 5 to 6 strokes type of thing. So the upside is there. This is a GPP type of video, obviously, where we're focusing on going against 20 to 30,000 other entries. And in that type of format, that is the exact type of player that I'm looking at. So if you're looking for safety, run away from a Sam Burns. But if you're looking for somebody that's going to be potentially criminally underowned and has that upside, he is going to be your guy. Next up, we have Tony Finau at $9,100, another guy who's relatively low owned in that lower teens range when it comes to the ownership. They're at 12.4%. And he's somebody who, what's the best way to put this? He's been okay of late. I really think that's the best way I can explain it. Just mediocre, average. It's just been making a ton of cuts. So if we take a look at the last 8 events, you see he is a 30th at the PGA, 41st at the Wells Fargo. He played pretty well at the Mexico Open, right? That was his one highlight of late. But 35th, 29th, just a lot of made cuts and they're not really doing anything with it. So you would expect his shots gain metrics to maybe be a little bit bummy, but he's gaining across the board. So not just gaining with the off the tee play and approach play, which we would expect pretty much any time you check on a Tony Finau, but he's starting to gain around the green and with the flat stick, which is really the X factor, right? If he's starting to gain with the short game, we already know he's going to be prolific with the numbers off the tee and on approach. That makes me really excited about the guy. And if we take a look at the course history, it gets even more exciting. He has a 20th, a 23rd, and a second place finish. So obviously, hasn't played here all that often, but when he has had some success. And even in 2017 was able to get a 29th place finish. So has been an absolute cup maker here. And if he can get, a little bit hot with the putter, like I'm sure he did there in 2019 when he finished in second, what's to say that he doesn't do the same thing this time around? He's in a very solid stretch of ball striking. The short game is starting to round into form, and he's clearly been able to get it done at this golf course before, which shouldn't be a surprise because his best surface when it comes to putting is on bent grass, where he gains nearly 0.2 of a stroke more per round than his baseline. So I like what I'm seeing from Tony Finau of late. I like the fact that he has familiarity both at this golf course and on the bent grass surface. So just a 12.4% ownership projection, going to have probably at least 2 to maybe even 3x the field there. And now lastly, we have Webb Simpson at $8,700, the last sleeper this week. And honestly, he's coming in with much better form than people want to give him credit for. I mean, at the PGA Championship, obviously impressed. Shot 5 under par on Saturday, which was by far the most difficult conditions they had all week. Was the round of the day by 2 strokes. So that shows you just how well he was striking the ball there over the weekend. But he's somebody who's great at positional golf courses. I mean, at Sedgefield, we've seen that for the Wyndham Championship. We've seen it at Harbour Town for the RBC Heritage. Just pretty much anytime you have a 7,200 yard or below golf course, you're going to want Webb Simpson. And particularly when it's a bent grass golf course where he gains over 1/4 of a stroke more per round on bent grass than any other surface. If we take a look at the recent form, it is starting to get there. He's close to gaining in every category but the putter. But like I said, the putting on bent grass is really a bright spot for him. And last week at the PGA Championship, he was making everything, right? So if we take a look at the last 24 rounds, certainly is losing to the field in that category. But last week, he looked like the Webb Simpson of old, right? And if he's able to putt like the Webb Simpson of old, hit the ball like he has over his last 24 to even last 50 measured rounds, that's not only going to be enough to make the cut. I mean, at a positional golf course like this is where Webb Simpson competes and potentially wins, right? So I think if this was a year ago, right, if you took a step back, maybe just 9 or 12 months ago, Webb Simpson would be 25, maybe 30% owned on this slate. Everyone would be talking about how this is a Webb Simpson week. it's crazy how everything changes after some injuries, right? He had the injuries in 2021. People are calling him overrated, which I think is just foolish. I think it's a little bit, you're taking that too far if you're saying that he's overrated, because he was dealing with injuries last year. He had to have a surgery, he had to take some time off. But that's why he didn't play, early on in the 2021-2022 season. And now he's starting to look like the Webb Simpson of old. So give him some time. He's going to round into form. And if last week was any semblance of things to come, right, I want to be early on Webb Simpson getting back, and especially at a positional golf course like this. So at 13.8%, I'd argue that's too low. I'm going to have something in that 25 to 30% range to get plenty of leverage. All right, that's all I've got for the fades and sleepers. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead and let me know who you're fading this week, and of course, who your biggest sleeper pick is. We're going to have our weekly DFS live stream. It'll be tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern time, so make sure to stop on by for that with any live questions that you have. We'll be talking weather, ownership projections, talking strategy, all that sort of fun stuff. So make sure to stop on by while you make your lineups. And also, as per usual, going to have content for Showdown throughout the weekend, some prize picks videos for you. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss any of that to come. Make sure you smash the like button before you hop on out of here as well. I'd appreciate that a ton. Let's get this cash this week, and I'll see you guys later on tonight.